Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Luke.
I'm Will.
And I'm Kate.
Today we're discussing Bleeding Edge, the whole book, the front to back of it, and everything contained within. Joining us for this wrap-up episode is Andrew, who many of our listeners may better know as Byron's Glowing Filament on Twitter, and is the creator of the Gravity's Rainbow Analysis Substack. If you're not familiar with that, we're going to leave a link in the show notes. But before we start into the discussion on Bleeding Edge, I wanted Andrew to have just a few minutes to kind of go over what he's been doing with that Substack, because it is a really, really cool resource for the book. And like I said, if you're not familiar with it, I would highly recommend taking some time and spending with it, because you can really pull a lot away from that. So Andrew, if you want to just kind of give yourself some promotional time on there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm Andrew, or like they said, Byron's Growing Filament on Twitter, or at Erectus Kvas. I'm currently writing for the Gravity's Rainbow Substack, which is just gravitiesrainbow.substack.com. I kind of decided to do it on a whim when my friend said he wanted to read Gravity's Rainbow. And so I was like, well, I'll read it for the fourth time along with you, and decided, oh my God, I'm getting so much more out of it this time. So why don't I analyze it a chapter at a time? And that continued to grow. I expected maybe a few hundred words per chapter. And unfortunately, to my own personal time, it is now becoming a few thousand words per chapter or more. So all it is really just a chapter by chapter analysis. For the longer chapters, like for example, Pokler's chapter, I'll split it into like 2 parts or even 3 parts, very rarely 3 parts, but sometimes. And it's a completely free resource for anybody who wants to kind of go along with it. It analyzes Gravity's Rainbow in a more, like, I guess, political sense, political, geopolitical, economics, all that kind of thing, as opposed to the typical literary analysis. And there's also, of course, a paid option, but that is entirely optional because it is a free resource for everybody who wants it, and I want to keep it that way for eternity. So that's about all I have to say about that one.
Awesome. How long have you been working on that?
It's been just over a year. I think I started in,
Wow.
I think that's probably a year and like 2 months now. I think it'll be finished in February of next year. And I think
Okay.
this is also not good for my own personal time, but I think I'm going to try and tackle the rest of them eventually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I was thinking of Mason and Dixon next. I was thinking of going maybe like chronologically. You guys have been talking about doing like a chronological read through. So I was thinking of going like chronologically for the rest of the books, obviously excluding Gravity's Rainbow, since that one will be done, and like kind of try and tie them into Gravity's Rainbow in the sense that Gravity's Rainbow is almost like a vortex where stuff leads into this war, and then everything else comes out of the war.
Mhm.
So that's the plan, at least.
Very cool. That's a huge undertaking. So best of luck on it. But
Thank
man,
you.
the Gravity's Rainbow stuff you've done so far has been really cool, and I've just been kind of keeping an eye on it here and there, and haven't had the opportunity to read the book along with your analysis of it yet. So the next time I dive into that one, I'm for sure going to be keeping that open. So thank you for doing that work, because it's great. And if you continue on, then thank you for continuing on with it as well.
Of course, I love doing it. It's actually just become a hobby of mine at this point, where I kind of look forward to like a weekend or 2 weekend writing sessions, and I've been enjoying it a lot.
I think that's a very relatable feeling to everybody on this show as well.
Yep. For sure. Well, let's go ahead and dive into the topic of our discussion today, which is, as I said, Bleeding Edge. We kind of talked last week in our discussion on the last 2 chapters about how our feelings on this book as a whole have sort of shifted over time, and especially after this reread. Luke, unfortunately, wasn't with us, so I wanted to get his opinion as well. But Andrew, I wanted to start with you. I assume this is not your first time reading Bleeding Edge?
No, but this is my 3rd time reading it. So my first time was quite a while ago, quite a long time ago, on my first read through of all Pynchon's stuff, and then I actually read it again. I think it was a crossover book between 2023 and 2024. I was reading it like near the end of 23, and then finished it, I think, in January. And then I decided to pick it up again for this episode, which I got the audiobook for, and slowly learned I am not meant for audiobooks because, oh my God, my mind wandered. But
Yep, me too. Me too.
Yeah, it was a nice way to do it, just so I didn't have to like dedicate a whole nother read just a few months after. But yeah,
Sure,
I
sure.
wow.
So yeah, I'm curious for your thoughts on this. Do you like where do you rank it within the rest of Pynchon's work? Where do you rank it just among other works in general? Has your feeling on it shifted at all since the first time you read it to the last time?
Always really loved this book. I think with every read I've appreciated it more and more, but I always thought it was kind of a shame that people spoke of it as if it was lesser Pynchon, as if it was, as you guys have said, just a lesser work in general. I think the first time I read it, I would probably still considered it lower in my ranking of his work, but considering I liked all of his works except for V, considering I've liked all of his works, I still think the worst of them, again, except for V, is still a very good book.
Uh-huh.
Second time I read it, I probably would have put it about halfway in his catalog, and then I think on this reread or this re-listen, I guess, I don't know, it's up there. It's like maybe number 4. I think the only ones I'd really put
Okay.
ahead of it would be Gravity's Rainbow, Inherent Vice, Crying a Lot 49. Man, I don't even know after that.
Hmm.
It's probably right around there.
Okay. What about everyone else? How I know Kate and Will and I have already kind of discussed it. So maybe Luke, we'll start with you. What have you warmed to this book? Well, I don't want to make it sound like you didn't like it at first, but has your perception of it changed since we finished the reading of it?
Honestly, not too much. I do feel like I kind of understand it more, have a better grasp on it. It's still probably my second least favorite after B of Pynchon's works. I do really like the ending of the book, at the very end, which I'll discuss last week. Like the very end is emotional and sentimental, and I really enjoyed that. It's just I wish the conspiracy in the book we got more answers. I wish the conspiracy kind of added up to something more. I do kind of still in my head kind of wonder what this book kind of adds up to cumulatively in terms of like what you're supposed to take out of it, and what you're supposed to kind of focus on, and what the conspiracy kind of encompasses, and what the conspiracy is. I feel like it's still nebulous in my head, and I do think that that's somewhat by design. I think I talked about this earlier in our series on Bleeding Edge, that like the conspiracy in this book is so kind of wide ranging and perhaps all encompassing in terms of the characters, at least, maybe not all encompassing in terms of like the world, but everyone, almost all the characters in this book seem in some way connected to it. So I do kind of wonder if if it's meant to be. I don't think it's meant to be understood, or you can't really wrap your head around it and stuff. I just wish that, and especially the last like 4, 5, 6 chapters, we kind of the focus on the narrative kind of goes away from the conspiracy, and I do wish that we had gotten more about that, and perhaps some type of resolution to it, or any type of answers. Even like to who killed Lester. I wish that we kind of had some type of answer to that. I've enjoyed our discussion. I my previous read of this book before we went back over it, I didn't think at all about whether or not parts of it that seem to be in real life are actually in Deep Archer, or what. I didn't really contemplate the line between reality and Deep Archer the first time I read it, and I did really enjoy that aspect of our discussion of it. Um, and I don't know. The thing is, like with Pynchon, like something, a book has to be your second least favorite, just in terms of like I don't. It's not necessarily a knock on this book. Like I do enjoy it a good amount. And it's um, better than a lot of other books that I've read by, especially literary fiction authors. It's just something has to be your second least favorite, so that it kind
Yeah,
of just has to be
sure.
this book. So
No, I see. I get where you're coming from. I kind of actually, I've been mulling on this in the last week since we did the last episode. I kind of like the unresolved feeling of it all. I think that, and I think I talked about this last week as well, that it sort of grounds it a little bit more in reality, in the sense that a lot of the so-called conspiracies that exist in the real world are often never really fully resolved, or if they are, if they ever achieve a sort of resolution, there's always a lingering sort of doubt that hangs over them because of the sort of conspiracy elements that have been shadowed over it all. So I think to have all these unanswered questions and these kind of loose ends, so to speak, in terms of the plot, not necessarily the characters, because I think most of the characters had their arcs wrapped up pretty well. But to have the sort of open-endedness of not knowing fully everything that happened, and did it, did this conclusion happen, or did it go this way or this way or this way? I think I like that in it. I like the ambiguity. I think that it just lends itself to feeling more real and a sort of, that is conspiracies. That is typically how they are, is they just don't ever resolve.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something I didn't necessarily consider. And I mean, it does, like everything surrounding 9/11, it's not quite as bad as a JFK assassination in terms of the amount of information floating around about it and the amount of theories floating around about it. But
It
the
also
other
hasn't
part,
had much time, so give it a few
yeah,
more decades, and it might get to that point.
I've seen some stuff on the Pynchon Reddit subreddit about some kind of some like the hijackers were living in America for a few years before they did the hijacking of the planes, and there are some kind of things that stick out as kind of logical inconsistencies in terms of like why did we not why did the U.S. government not realize that there were these guys, like the whole thing about them, they were not interested in learning how to land planes, they were just interested in learning how to take off and fly planes and stuff like that, where like there should have been there are aspects of the 9/11 conspiracy that are kind of reminiscent, or of 9/11 that are kind of reminiscent. I don't want to call it a conspiracy necessarily, but that are reminiscent of the JFK assassination, just in terms of like there are things that don't make sense and aspects of it that I don't think anyone really in the world can kind of wrap their head around.
Well, I think part of it too, as far as the reasoning behind the ending having this sort of unresolved feeling, is that 9/11 is also something that inflicted mass amount of trauma on the population, and it had no resolution. Like, yeah, we invaded Afghanistan, but Afghanistan didn't attack America. A terrorist cell that operated partially in that country did, and there was no actual resolution as to like the actual conflict there. We stayed in those wars for a really long time, and then eventually left and didn't accomplish anything. And not just that, but from a perspective of trying to wrap your head around how something like that could happen back when it did, that's something that nobody could do. It felt like absolutely impossible for this mass event to have occurred on American soil, the first attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, to the degree that Hawaii was American territory at that point. And you're left with a populace who has no ability to explain or understand why or how this thing had happened, which matches the vastness of the conspiracy that Maxine begins to poke at. It isn't so much a thing to be understood or explained. It's just a reality you have to live in now, and how you react to that, because it was used as such a precursor to creating the modern world that we live in from a perspective of the security apparatus or social media or the intelligence agencies and all the rest of it that she kind of flits in and out of.
Yeah, and then to expand a little even further on that line of reasoning, there's all the discussion post 9/11 in the book about the ways that people, revert to less, at least emotionally mature forms of themselves, or, try to develop like a sense of, like a hyper-defined sense of justice.
Mhm.
And between just kind of the collective confusion that I think parts of that symbolize, it's also, most of the book is from Maxine's perspective. It doesn't float, the narrator doesn't float around as much as some of Pynchon's other books of this length. And so it kind of makes sense that, as she is, compromising herself, if you want to frame it that way, by, becoming closer with Horst. And she sees, Windust's body, and she, talks to Lester in the, this kind of symbolic underworld of Deep Archer, that she's not necessarily distracted, but she's done. She can't handle trying to connect the dots anymore, because those hard links to the actual conspiracy are gone. And sure, there's like Gabriel Ice and a few other random people, but they are so compromised that there's no reason for her to believe that she can do anything. And I think there's kind of a strong unity in the themes and the characterization of the narrator, to have it kind of just peter out in that way, because you have the emotional climax, whether it's between, you know, finding Windust's body, whether that's in real life or not, or meeting Shiomara, whatever, wherever you want to place it precisely, even, you know, when March and March and Talus reconnect. You have the climax, and that's it. That's the end of Maxine's ability to find these threads because they're all cut off.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like Oedipa after the stamp auction.
Well, and this isn't in our notes, but I think we need to get it out of the way. Andrew, are you a patriot or do you hate America? Do you believe the official story of 9/11, or are you a secret terrorist?
I hate America. Not actually hating America. I hate what America stands for. I love America as a people. I love the people who live here, but I definitely subscribe to some sort of, like, I wouldn't even say conspiratorial beliefs surrounding the event, but I find it hard to believe that everything that could have occurred within this was at least unknown. So I'm not one who's going to say Bush did 9/11, though I will say that because it's kind of funny and he deserves his reputation to be tarnished. But it's not that I truly believe that. It's more that I think that there were probably people within the government, probably people within any sort of deep state like a CIA, who would have at least, if not participated in, at least known that something was going to happen, and possibly allowed it to happen, or at least didn't do anything to stop it because it allowed us to basically do anything we wanted for the rest of eternity or for the rest of the coming wars. So, do I hate America? In some aspects. But,
yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, and we've kind of touched on that before too, with the idea that, you know, whether or not there was complicity within the government, or not even complicity, but, you know, whether or not anyone actually knew what was going to happen or when or anything, they certainly seized the opportunity, as you said, to justify the number of wars that have gone on since then, and that will continue to go on. And it certainly shifted the culture in such a way that they have that power now for a very long time, until there is another major shift that can maybe, you know, return the balance in a sense. But yeah, I totally agree with all of that.
I think it also kind of ties into, I know you guys have been talking a lot about the Gravity's Rainbow and this being kind of like a new testament toward it. A chapter I just read in Gravity's Rainbow was when, I think it was, when Enzian and his group were going across the zone, and they were seeing these destroyed, like, industrial works. And one of the coolest quotes, I don't have it on me, but it's talking about how these places are planned to be destroyed, not because not just because of the means of the war, but in order to build something up that is different than it, that is kind of like another step towards increasing the levels of destruction that they might be able to cause. And I feel like to some extent this is that type of thing where the towers weren't built so they could be brought down, but when it became beneficial for them to be brought down, or to be allowed to be brought down, it was an opportunity that was seized in order to, again, build something up that could further the goal of the capital T them.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because both Kate and Will have talked about their idea of Bleeding Edge as a sort of New Testament to Gravity's Rainbow's Old Testament. And given your, you know, extreme time spent on Gravity's Rainbow, do you think there is a sort of direct correlation between those two that allows them to operate as sort of complementary works?
Absolutely. I have like a few pretty major points regarding that stuff that I want to talk about throughout this. I don't really want to go over all of them like right away, but I think there's a huge tie-in between these two books. The main one that I've noticed is that that not all of his books focus on a major event. They kind of show the fallout of major events. So, for instance, Mason and Dixon shows the fallout of the colonization of America and so on. His California trilogy shows the fallout of World War II and the Cold War, but they don't surround those events. Whereas Gravity's Rainbow is basically the focal point is World War II, or Bleeding Edge, the focal point is 9/11, these world-shattering events that kind of changed how everything was going to happen. So both of them, I was saying earlier that I kind of want to cover Gravity's Rainbow as a vortex for all these things surrounding it, but I feel like Bleeding Edge also acts as that, where 9/11 is almost the next World War II. It's that next major event that changed the world entirely.
That's an excellent point about his books not centering directly on one event. That is very true. Those two are the only ones that actually really do are rather directly tied to the event itself, rather than sort of aftershocks of it. So with that kind of expanding out from that idea, what about Bleeding Edge do you think was received poorly by a chunk of his fans? You had mentioned in your thoughts about the book that you felt it was sort of incorrectly received or unfairly regarded by some. What do you think it is about this book that kind of sticks in the craw of listeners when it does, or readers rather, when it does have, that direct tie to his most famous work as far as the importance of the events at hand that it's talking about?
There's obvious recency bias, of course, but like getting that out of the way, it's really hard to say. I do think there's a lot more focus on some more like modern ideas and some more modern like references to video games and things such as that. And I feel like people kind of read into them as if like Fiction has no idea what he's talking about when he's talking about Metal Gear Solid, which sure, maybe to some extent, but I feel like his incorporation of those types of references did a pretty good job
Yeah.
as someone who loves Metal Gear Solid. But to me, it's more fascinating than anything because I can like probably find a few other things to mention why I think it wasn't well received. But upon reading it, if I wouldn't have known that it wasn't well received, it would have blown my mind because I just thought it was as good as so many of his other works.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think its reputation very much precedes it, and I think this goes back to the I can't remember who it was that reviewed it and coined the term essentially bench on light, which we've talked about a lot in the Vineland episode about how much we hate that term. But I think what a lot of people come away from, or at least the accusation that they level at it, is that it doesn't feel as encyclopedic or as maybe as feverish as Gravity's Rainbow did. But having read this book, I think this was my third time through it now, but having gone through it as deeply as we have on these last several months, it's absolutely chock full of all kinds of incredibly weird and obscure references and facts. And to your point about the stuff about video games, I think maybe there is a sort of recency bias to that, and that people, like you said, don't think he knows what he's talking about, or it feels a little maybe shoehorned in because of its recency. But all the other obscure details and mentions of all the stuff going on in South America, and the numerous technological Easter eggs that are sort of hidden in there. I think this book is as dense as Gravity's Rainbow in less pages. I think it just hasn't had the same amount of time to really cook, so to speak, for lack of a better term. It hasn't had the 50 years that Gravity's Rainbow has had for people to really dissect it and analyze it and sit with it and discover all of its little secrets. This book is barely 10 years old now. Right. And I think that as time goes on, more and more people will come to it and understand what it's getting at and appreciate it for what it's trying to do. Because at the end of the day, this is a very well-written book by an author who is at the top of his game and has had a major shift in his ability to write not just narratives, but to write characters, which adds so much depth to the story than he did back in 1973 when Gravity's Rainbow came out. And that's, nothing against Gravity's Rainbow. It's a fantastic book, but it lacks that character work that Bleeding Edge, that Vineland, that Mason and Dixon, that Against the Day and Inherent Vice all have. And I think that a lot of people tend to ignore that in favor of the sort of whirlwind experience that Gravity's Rainbow can be. But maybe it's me as an older reader too, that I take away more from his understanding of family dynamics and how Maxine's children are such a vital part of her life that play into the story so intricately and so deeply that just adds so much more to my experience personally. I mean, that could be what it is. Either way, I think this is a book that is way better than people give it credit for. And I think a lot of people just take the fact that it hasn't been as well received before they go into it, and that colors their response to it.
I'm going to, serve my role on the show and push back slightly. I think that a major issue with the way that people received this book, and it ties back into Gravity's Rainbow as well, is that there is so much of that character work going on, and so much of it is foregrounded in the text of the book. But if you go back to Gravity's Rainbow, as I've mentioned a few different times, I would contend that there's a ton of very insightful character work in Gravity's Rainbow. However, it was a book that came out 50 years ago. It was a book that came out, half as long ago as books like The Sound and the Fury and Ulysses, to point at two of them. Books that really, tried to put stream of consciousness as the overall concept of a work, right? And I think that Gravity's Rainbow's character are better developed than they are given credit for in most cases, through those very subtle touches of streams of consciousness. And that is why I think some people feel like Bleeding Edge may not be so encyclopedic. You only really have the one perspective. I mean, it floats around a little bit, but it's for paragraphs, not for 40 pages, not from the perspective of a light bulb, not from all those crazy experimental sections of Gravity's Rainbow. And it was in the early 70s, so you had this acceptance of the kind of the more mystical and the spiritual stuff as the kind of thing that would be acceptable to talk about in a book about World War II. You have people like Vogler representing the rocket mystics of the 1910s and 20s, and you have people of all walks of life in the first half of the 20th century that are talking about spiritualism in whatever form you want to call spiritualism, whether it's theosophy or American spiritualism or just kind of the new wave melange or new age melange. And so with Bleeding Edge, that's not there because I think the tastes of the reader these days wouldn't accept it because people don't notice the characterization going on in the narrative of Bleeding Edge as much as there is the foregrounded characterization. There's a lot in between the lines as well. But you also just don't have that avenue. You don't have people walking around Manhattan who are doing tarot and taking it seriously and consciously thinking that tarot is like the same thing as rocket science. That's not a thing that exists anymore.
That's a fair point. You're absolutely. I mean, I see where you're coming from, and yeah, I mean, the time frame definitely colors a lot of that as well. I think maybe the fact that Bleeding Edge also came out in the internet age. You had the echo chamber of people online, where one person's review of it can kind of reverberate off of the walls of those echo chambers a lot more than it did back in 1973. But I don't know. I think over time, I'm thinking that the reception to this book will warm a little bit more than it has.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that level.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think to a certain degree, it's harder to, especially when you think about the sort of demographic of Pynchon's readers, it's harder for you to assume that things that you are intimately familiar with are important. Like when you read a book that has all these references to Beanie Babies or Melanie's Mall or Metal Gear Solid or like the things that you yourself have direct influence, from your youth with, it's probably harder for you to think to yourself, yeah, that was like really the like bywords of these, cultural touchstones, and they were really important. And like, there's a direct criticism of Metal Gear Solid in this book from a perspective of like it being outgrowth of the military industrial complex's sort of like goals with the internet when Ernie's talking to Maxine towards the end of it. And that can also be something where if you have like a lot of experience with Metal Gear Solid yourself, you're probably like, hey, that's not like fair. These games are really fun or whatever. Whereas you read this book from 1970s, and again, you're at the same demographic of readers for Bleeding Edge, and suddenly this a bit more esoteric seeming, referential, dictionary like novel suddenly has a completely different sort of veneer or sheen on it than it does when compared to something from your own time period. So I guess turning that question back to you, Andrew. How do you feel about the comparison in encyclopedic nature between these two books? Do you think there is some similarity there? Do you think that Bleeding Edge is less so? What are your thoughts?
I land between a lot of this. I think it does have a massive encyclopedic knowledge in a different realm than Gravity's Rainbow, but I do think Gravity's Rainbow does take it a step further. Clearly, Gravity's Rainbow is not just longer, but there's a lot more complexity within certain passages, and I think he really dissects that era and dissects what was happening to our world in that era a fair bit more so than he did in Bleeding Edge, which
Mhm.
I don't think is him necessarily trying to keep it shorter or keep it more concise. It just has to do with the fact that the events of Gravity's Rainbow occurred 70 years, 20, 30 years before he was actually writing the book. So there was more knowledge on what was occurring and what the outgrowth would be like. Whereas this, he was only writing it about 10 years after the event. So I think, yes, it is more encyclopedic than some of his other works, such as Lot 49, but I don't think it is as dense or complex as something like Gravity's Rainbow necessarily.
Well, so to kind of bounce off of that discussion point, so Andrew, you teach high school level English. Do you think that, and I'm going to make this kind of a two-part question, do you think that an author like Pynchon is too challenging for readers of that age? Like, I'm thinking junior, senior level of high school. And, if you feel that, and I ask this because you would have more experience with them than any of us for sure. Do you think that something like Bleeding Edge would be a good entry point for not just younger readers, but for people maybe unfamiliar with his work? Do you think this is a good kind of jumping off point to get an idea of what he brings to the table as an author in terms of the complexity of his writing and the density of the story and the themes and the characters? Or do you think there's a sort of better entry point than this?
So I taught The Crime of Lot 49 last year to my honors senior class, and it was generally well received, with a few people just very, very confused, not necessarily about what was going on, but why on earth all these songs were being included, or why on earth these weird, weird scenes were occurring, and what the point of them all was. So I think Pynchon is very much accessible at a high school level. I think it does require some sort of enjoyment or love of literature, because I taught it to my honors seniors who specifically joined that class because they like literature or they like the humanities. So I think it requires an appreciation for that sort of thing. But I do think it is very possible at that level. I think Lot 49 is a great entry point. I think Bleeding Edge is another great entry point. I think Inherent Vice is probably the third one I would select. I actually had one of my girls chose that as her individual book for the final book they read right after we read Lot 49, and she said it was probably harder than anything she's ever read on her own, just because she had to keep track of so many things, but she was able to do it. So
Nice.
I very much think it's possible for that level to enjoy it. Now, though, one caveat is that I would probably get fired if I taught Inherent Vice or Bleeding Edge because of
Yeah.
all the sexual content, all of the other stuff that's within those ones, as opposed to Lot 49, which it tames it down a little bit.
Sure.
But yeah, I do think Bleeding Edge, in terms of being a little more streamlined, is a good entry point for really anybody, even if we're not talking about high school students. It would be a great one to start with, I think, especially since it's more accessible for the content, since we've all, or I guess I hope we've all lived through some of these events.
Yeah, certainly.
Oh my god! But yeah, so I guess my seniors did not live through those events. I forget that they were born like
Yeah.
in 2008 or whatever.
That's a
Jesus.
weird concept.
Yeah.
So I take that back.
Do you think that there's going to be anything that comes after Bleeding Edge? I've talked a bit over the course of this particular season of the show that there doesn't really seem to be any reason why Pynchon would need to continue. Like, one, he's probably not going to be around long enough to like experience all of these time frames that he likes to sort of set his books in. But also, two, it feels like this book is a bit more direct in its conversations about, you know, what the reader should do. Like there's some direct call to action stuff here. There's some sort of direct sort of like wrap ups of these like long arcs of history as sort of a new epic like starts. Do you see him going any further? Do you think that there's really any reason to, or do you feel like this book has kind of a natural conclusion to the project of what he'd been writing about for, you know, the past 50 years?
If you were to write about something, it would have to be, I don't know, the Civil War. It's like he's covered really every major era of American history, the 20th century in a ton of depth, the 21st century in a good amount of depth, Bleeding Edge, and then he obviously has done Mason and Dixon and Against the Day. So really the only thing he hasn't talked about is the Civil War. Now, do I see him doing that? Absolutely not. I mean, maybe there's the
Yeah.
possibility, and if he does, it's not like I'm going to be upset because I would adore reading another one of his books, but I don't think it's going to happen. And I think one of the major reasons is this book, like you were saying, does have a send off to the reader and a call to action. One of my main things that I noticed on this read through was when we were looking at Gravity's Rainbow and we're looking at the counterforce within Gravity's Rainbow, it includes the main characters. It includes Pirate, Katya, and all of them who, even though Slothrop is probably the main Pynchon analog throughout that book, I feel like Pirate also has a lot of Pynchon within him. And Pynchon was maybe not intentionally, but was drawing a parallel between him sending or him being a part of the counterforce who's kind of trying to negate these evils in the world, and Pirate also doing the same within the book, or Kaya also doing the same within the book. And I think his counterforce with Bleeding Edge is something a bit different. We saw one of the main things of the counterforce I saw in Bleeding Edge is Misha and Grisha, who just go off at the end and send off an EMP to Gabriel Ice, which isn't necessarily like what you would consider like, oh, this is true revolutionary action. But, and I'm sorry for bringing up Gravity's Rainbow, but in Gravity's Rainbow, when Slothrop is kind of walking through the zone at the end of part 3, and he's like talking to the trees almost, they say like the one thing he can do to help them and to help us survive is the next time he comes across like a rig that's cutting down trees is to just take its oil filter. Something simple like that. It's like a death by a thousand cuts as opposed to true like massive revolutionary action, because there's no chance as an individual that we can cause a revolt on our own, but all these little things can add up. Like Misha and Grisha sending an EMP into Gabriel Ice's facility, I think is him saying that, okay, I was Pirate once and I was part of that counterforce. Now let's send you goofy people out and become the counterforce as well.
That's a really good point. I hadn't considered those two in that context, but that definitely maps. Absolutely agree with all of that. And I agree that it's also, you know, I think it is the little things that make the bigger difference. I think the bigger actions tend to be noticed more quickly and can be stopped a lot faster, whereas the smaller actions tend to slip under the radar a little bit more and you know, as you mentioned, that death by a thousand cuts, those smaller little things can reverberate out and have bigger impact. So it definitely feels like that's kind of what he's pointing at with that section.
Yeah, and I guess that gets to one of the questions I was going to ask, which you kind of answered already in the you know, answer you just provided. But if you have additional detail, feel free to give it. Of this idea that, especially from like Vineland forward, that concept of like the little things one can do sort of continue to gain importance. At the end of Vineland, he gives that analogy from I think it was an Emerson novel about this like cosmic scale that constantly is tipping back and forth when, you know, the powers that be press their thumb down on it, but then you can kind of even it out with these small everyday acts. And then there's a lot of talk about that, especially in this book towards the end, as he's kind of like talking directly to the reader more often. Do you feel that was something that he always had in mind, or do you feel like that started to develop as he got later into his life? Obviously, with things like what you just pulled out of Gravity's Rainbow, there were some sort of precursors in that you know, conception of how to kind of fight back against the capital T they. But if you have any other thoughts on either how that developed or its presence across his canon, I'd be curious to hear it.
I think he kind of was humbled a little bit, maybe, after writing Gravity's Rainbow. I don't think that he has ever said, okay, we shouldn't bring these bigger revolutions to action, and neither am I. I think that would be great. But I think he was humbled a bit and realized that, okay, but not every individual has this kind of power. Not every individual is willing to put themselves in danger. Not every individual is capable of this type of action. But what we are capable of is like stealing that oil filter, or is something that leads to these death by 1,000 cuts, even if that's just posting something on Twitter or posting something on Instagram that people might disagree with, but might enlighten them a little bit. I love doing that kind of thing. I love making my family mad and posting political things on my Instagram. And
Hell yeah.
a lot of people will say it's kind of pointless because you're not going to change their mind. And I think that's probably true. But even if there is an inkling of doubt in their mind, or even if they say something that might lead someone else to think about something that leads someone else to think about something in this regard, I think that it becomes more likely that something might change. And I think Pynchon was maybe a little more pessimistic in that we needed pure revolution when he was writing Gravity's Rainbow, which again, okay, sure. But I think once he started writing Violent and he started seeing the family life that came out of his own life, and then within his characters, he was realizing that these smaller actions are just as important as bigger scale actions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on that note, regarding you're bringing up the family aspect of things. One of the we talked about this, especially with Vineland, and especially with this as well, that the inclusion of family and the importance of family and especially children has been very prevalent in his Vineland and on work. We've also talked about just the characters that he has built in that time and how more attention they're kind of given in those stories. And with this one, I know at least Kate and myself, and I think Will as well. I don't want to speak for both of them, but I think we all kind of landed in the same place as Maxine being one of, if not our favorite, of Pynchon's protagonists. Do you how do you feel about her particularly as a protagonist? And on top of that, is she your favorite character in this book, or is there another character that kind of spoke to you more, that you felt more focused on through your reading?
I think she is one of his most fully developed characters from a character perspective. I love a lot of the characters that he's done, even in his earlier works like Slothrop, but I do feel like Gravity's Rainbow had more archetypes. Despite the fact that I still think they were beautifully characterized, but I do think they more served as a sort of archetype for something he was trying to convey. Whereas now we have Maxine, who is Maxine and who is a full normal person. I think she might be my favorite within this book as well. I love March for all her flaws, just because I love hearing her conspiratorial rantings, and I do think she maybe she represents Pynchon in the past. I'm not sure if you guys said that on the show, but I feel like I remember you saying something like that. And I think she represents Pynchon in the past, whereas Maxine might be a more level-headed Pynchon of now. But I can't help but not like her. I mean, I've had those thoughts. I probably still have some of those thoughts, and whether or not they're fully rational, I think that there's something to be said for her just being so willing to be upfront with it and to go speak it in a high school, even, or middle school even. But Maxine is just so lovable and such a good person and such a well-rounded character who cares so much, not just about herself, but about the kind of things that she's trying to solve, about her children, the fact that she's willing to put up with Horst in order to better her children's lives, which I wouldn't say anybody should do, but the fact that she does it is still pretty commendable. So yeah, she's just a wonderful, wonderful character, and that's probably, I don't know if I would say it's his best ever, but it's his most likable, most lovable, and one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah, no, and we've definitely talked about Maxine March Kelleher being a sort of mouthpiece for Pynchon, and Ernie as well, I think, and that's why I really enjoyed the conversations that Ernie and Maxine had. They felt very much like these sort of the old and newer Pynchon kind of working out these ideas and how his past has shaped his future and his present, and to watch the dynamic between those two and just kind of imagine him crafting those scenes and really the sort of, I think almost it might have been cathartic to just get that all out on the page and given this book's feelings of finality for him as an author, it really makes those sections of the book a lot more powerful and impactful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that there's something to be said for that. What March says is largely true to an extent, but her pessimism surrounding it all, I think, is what Pynchon grew out of. And I think he became far more optimistic about the future of the world, even though it's kind of weird to say that because so many of his books do have such an incredible amount of pessimism, and it's all about the bad things that America's done or is doing. But either way, I do think he's grown to be more optimistic. It's not all about capital T them is we have no way to fight against them. Now it's about we're sending our kids off into the future down the elevator, and that's another sign of him sending us off. As I don't want to say like we are his children, but it's kind of like it's kind of like an analog to that as well. He is sending us off. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important part of this to focus on is that relationship with his kids, and I think that optimism that you're talking about, I think that stems more from him having kids, because we see that more in his works after he had a child, and I think he is seeing that he's done what he can, not just as an author but as a person, and whatever he contributed to the counterculture movement in the 60s and whatever else he worked on in his personal life to push his ideas and his thoughts on the way things were going in the world. But to see when you have a kid, and I can speak for myself on this because I have two of them, you have a sort of renewed sense of hope and faith, because you can see that as they grow, you kind of have this ability to see them start to take control of themselves and what they're capable of, and know that they can go out and use that to enrich the world and try to change things for the better in ways that we didn't have available to us when we were that age. So there is kind of that sense of, we did what we could and we failed, but now it's your generation's turn to go out and to make that change. And you have all these new tools and resources that are available to you. And I spoke about this last week in our chapters 40 and 41 episode, that I think the generation that is coming up now is very, very primed to really have a good shot at kind of taking back the power that should belong to them, that's been stripped of the younger generations for so many years now. So there is, I think, that sense of hope that comes from that. And I think that's part of what resonates so much with me about this book.
Another question I had for you too, Andrew, was whether you had any thoughts about why he portrayed the internet the way that he did, especially the deep web. Obviously, a lot of that stuff, as we talked about, was kind of becoming a thing as far as like interactive, online gaming and sort of like low poly, like world building for 3D environments and all of that, but was still not at all to the degree of what Maxine is experiencing. Do you think he's doing something in particular by rendering the internet that way?
I do. I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's part of the points I wanted to bring up in the tie-in between Gravity's Rainbow and Bleeding Edge as an Old and New Testament. Like, for example, in Gravity's Rainbow, we saw that the capital T them or their minions, like Pokler or like Pointsman, were attempting to make some sort of amalgamation of life and machine, like the organic and the inorganic. We were seeing life being put into the quintuple zero rocket. We were seeing the plastic, which acts as a kind of like a skin-like texture, an erectile texture is how he puts it, into the quintuple zero, and then Gottfried inside of that. It's merging man and machine. But Bleeding Edge, especially since it surrounds another one of those major events, which only Gravity's Rainbow really has, is taking it a step further, and it's showing life into some sort of binary process. It's kind of abstracting even man to machine. Now it's showing man to zeros and ones, man to a realm that we can't physically see or physically touch. It's a thing that's like well beyond our comprehension, and it's not organic. It's not even inorganic. It's so abstract that I can't even fathom what to say. I can't even fathom what to call it. It's just a purely electric phenomenon, which I guess saying electric makes me realize that in Gravity's Rainbow, it's the focus on the carbon or those inorganic molecules or atoms. But now it's a focus on the electrons. It's a focus on something that's far smaller, far more abstract. And I think that's what he's kind of saying about this, is that the next step is them taking things to this abstract level and being able to control us at a level that we can't even comprehend, let alone see. So I think that's kind of the purpose of his inclusion of the internet and of these vast realms of technology within Bleeding Edge.
Yeah, I agree. So that brings to the second question of, do you have any conspiracies about whether certain aspects of this book take place in Deep Archer that aren't explicitly said to? How do you feel about those later moments where Maxine is having a hard time grasping what is reality and what isn't?
So my thought is that it does not take place within Deep Archer. I don't believe it takes place within virtual reality, but I think part of the purpose is to give us that sort of paranoia surrounding that, so that Maxine is unaware of what's real and what's not. Just like us, seeing the internet, seeing it for what it is as an abstract entity that we can't really comprehend. We also question what's real that we see on it, or what is fake that we also see on it. So I do believe Maxine is experiencing all these things, and I'd be happy to be proven wrong if she wasn't. But I've never really read into this book as if she was living some moments within Deep Archer and then some moments within the Manhattan meat space. But I think that's kind of the point. That's why he's another reason why he's including the internet, is because I also don't know what I'm living in right now.
As you know, I think unnecessarily done apologized for relating so much of this book back to Gravity's Rainbow. The other book that you've spent a significant amount of time talking about in a semi-public sphere is Lot 49, and as I've mentioned a few times going through the book with the podcast, I began to see a lot of similarities, a lot of analogs between the Lot 49 and Bleeding Edge. And first of all, getting to the question now, what are your thoughts on Pynchon's own distaste for the crying of Lot 49? Do you buy into the more conspiratorial, he's publicly disregarding it so that people don't take it seriously thing, so that other people can take it seriously? Do you think he just doesn't like it in hindsight? Do you see where those flaws might be, I guess?
I don't really buy into it, honestly. I have always felt that it was a weird that he stated it, because it's such an amazing book, and it has writing on the level of Gravity's Rainbow. There are passages in there that are so mind blowing. The one that comes to mind being when Oedipa comes across the sailor with the Tristro tattoo, and she sees him as some sort of like sun god who has witnessed the entirety of history, and it's unfathomable that a human can write like that. And then there's just the thematic content that he was going over within that book is so incredible as well, that when I read that he disowned it, I was like, okay, what? That makes no sense. And the more I look into it, the more I do kind of, and I readily admit that I'm into like conspiracies and all of that. So I kind of readily buy into the fact that he's disowning it for a purpose. I mean, recently, before the book, his friend Richard Farina passed, and I think that he was kind of scared of that kind of thing happening, or at least not before the book, but before his writing of the Slow Learner essay. And I think he was kind of afraid that, well, if some sort of counter-revolutionary like my friend could die, maybe I could too, and I don't want that to happen. But I find it hard to believe. And I think that the reason he would disown something like The Crying of Lot 49 and not something like Gravity's Rainbow is because the point of The Crying of Lot 49 is so much more, and I don't want to say obvious, but it is so much more tangible to the average reader that someone could pick up an 150-page book and kind of get the point of what he's trying to convey. Whereas something like Gravity's Rainbow is a lot more broad and abstract, and instead of attacking a specific power structure, it's attacking all power structures within the world. So it's far less likely that someone who's saying, hey, all of this is terrible, and this is why all of this is terrible, is going to be targeted, as opposed to someone writing a short, concise 150-page novella saying, this is exactly what is wrong, and this is the person, or this is the group who is committing these crimes. So yeah, I'm a little bit conspiratorial in that sense, but I think it's hard not to be when you read his works.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, I can see that, but at the same time, I also I try to look at it from the other side of just him as a professional, and looking back at his work when he was younger, and just being like, I could have done better. But I think that's kind of the too easy answer to that, and I do kind of I feel like you're onto something with what you're talking about as far as the pointedness of Lot 49 against the more wide-reaching criticisms that Gravity's Rainbow and his subsequent works have had as well. And I think maybe he took that, I don't want to call it a loss, but he took a lesson away from that of, if I'm going to make these criticisms and I'm going to level these allegations at these power structures, I need to do it in broader strokes so that it can't really be used against me personally in any sort of way. But also, I think it complements his work in a sense that it gets people more into searching for more information about what it is he's talking about. And with something like Lot 49, because of its conciseness, it's, there's only so much. I don't want to say there's only so much you can dig out of that, because you could really pull apart that book in so many different ways. But there's less to run with in there, just simply because of the length of it. Whereas his books that, the bigger ones, there's so much to pull out from there, and so much that you can dig into and read. And really, you could spend probably your whole life on just one of those books and never really unpack everything that is contained within those.
Yeah, completely agree. And like you said, there is definitely the possibility that he just didn't like it, which if he didn't, then I'm proven wrong, and that's perfectly okay. But I like to I don't like to ignore the possibilities.
Oh,
but
sure.
hey, maybe the dude just matured and was like, that wasn't my best.
Well, that's the thing. That's where it falls apart for me, because if he's going to look back on, if we're looking at the slow learner essay, if he's going to look back on the 3 books that he wrote in that time, and he's going to point at Lot 49 as the one he doesn't like, I struggle with that.
100%. B is by far my least favorite of his works. I hate to use the word objectively, but I've read that book a few times, and each time I was like, oh my god, this is overwrought. This is not that good. It's not entertaining. I don't know. It's not that I think it's a bad book, which I kind of do, admittedly, but it's more that I just, compared to everything else, I cannot fathom how people are like, this is his best book.
It's this weird first album syndrome that I find with a lot of bands, where the fan base, there's this little collective of the fan base that'll always hold on to that debut album and be like, that's their best work, and ignore how much growth they have had in the years after that and the works after that. And I think that's the case with Pynchon. I think there's a very small subset of fans, and I mean, no offense by this, but it's not his best by any means. I hate to say it, like you said, I hate to say objectively, it's not his best. It's an okay book on its own, but he clearly is capable of so much more and has proved that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. That's just it is interesting to people that hold on to that, but to each their own. I'm not here to judge anyone's tastes in books.
Yeah, and so that very, very conveniently brings me to the second part of my open-ended question for you, Andrew. If we're talking about V and Gravity's Rainbow, as I think a lot of people have, even right after Gravity's Rainbow came out, viewing, the pun of Gravity's Rainbow is V2, but also just the more, narrative structure analysis, V is very deliberately and kind of painfully, if you ask me, built as two intersecting linear character narratives, right? And Gravity's Rainbow is the parabola. What do you take from the idea that maybe Bleeding Edge is crying of Lot 50?
Yeah, I was wondering where you were going with that. That I can definitely see that, though. In terms of like a narrative structure, it for sure does mimic a lot of those California novels like Lot 49, where it's the detective delving more and more into these conspiracies, but instead of finding a solution or finding a clue that leads her to something, it instead she finds a clue that leads her further off into just questioning everything. It's very narratively similar to Lot 49 or even Inherent Vice. Thematically, I'm trying to put that together. I feel like it does, because to me, Lot 49, and I admit that this isn't purely my train of thought. It probably comes a lot from Michael Judge's reading of Lot 49, where a lot of it has to do with the JFK conspiracy and how America kind of fell out from that assassination. And I feel like Bleeding Edge is attempting to do a similar thing with 9/11, where it's not, I mean, I guess it's pretty clear what happened in JFK right now, but at least now it's not exactly clear what was going on in the 9/11 attacks. But whether or not it was planned, whether or not it was acted upon by the CIA or by any deep state, like the JFK assassination was in the 60s, that kind of, it does matter, but it's just showing the kind of like outpouring that occurred afterward and what the search towards some sort of solution would look like and what realms that would take someone into.
I was just going to ask if there was anything else in the connective tissue between Bleeding Edge and Gravity's Rainbow that you wanted to talk about before we kind of started to wrap up.
There's a couple just main points, and these aren't like big thematic things that really tie them together like the other stuff we talked about were, but it just kind of just goes to solidify the fact that this really is almost like a second Gravity's Rainbow. One that kind of struck me upon reading this was that a lot of the characters, like Windust or Gabriel Ice, are working for these agencies and are committing these evil acts somewhere across the world and bringing them back home. And I feel like that really ties into the characters like Pinch, or like not Pinch, like Slothrop, like Pirate, who are also working for these agencies and slowly understanding that the agencies they're working for do not have the greater good of the world in mind. Similar to how Windust comes back to America, and I mean, Windust is an evil, horrible person, but he does realize, like, oh, they're planning something else that I need to try and help stop, or at least that was my reading of what he was doing and why he was possibly killed. Similar to how Pirate, in his crazy, crazy dream of hell, realizes the same thing. And then the other major tie-in I saw, and this is, I have no idea if I'm right about this at all, and it's just my reading. So I'm curious to hear y'all's thought on this idea. But there's the ghost in the basement in Gabriel Ice's house, the kind of holographic hallucination that Maxine sees that sets her just running away. And in Gravity's Rainbow, I was reading Bleeding Edge while I was reading Gravity's Rainbow. I was reading the passage when Greta Erdman and Slothrop get to Bad Karma, and they see that kind of ghost floating within Bad Karma. And to me, it was such a stark comparison. The descriptions were kind of, they were differently worded, but they were still uncannily the same. And I just felt like this creature was supposed to represent the sins that brought us to the point within this world. So the fact that we have abused and experimented on these children in these facilities that Gabriel Ice helped house is kind of similar to what we did at Bad Karma, because to me, Bad Karma represents some sort of waypoint from America just being an observer of the evils of the world to being an active participant of it. And again, Gabriel Ice, being similar to Slothrop, was an observer or someone who was just working within this tech industry and then became an active participant again within that. So even though he wasn't a main character like Slothrop, I do think that he was supposed to do something similar on a thematic level. So I just realized that was a lot of talking, but those are the major two major ideas: the tie-ins between the characters like Windust and Pirate, and the tie-in with the ghost in Bad Karma and Gabriel Ice's estate.
Well, I mean, especially if it is a Bad Karma thing, it would make sense why Gabriel Ice sort of declines physically and mentally the further that the book goes on. Like he's sort of made this deal with the powers that be that has massively shift his karmic debt, which there's a lot of talk about with Windust as well. This idea of these karmic adjusters eventually found him, or the only people that could really take care of this man at this point because of the level of power he has is because of this sort of negative karma. The same thing is definitely true of Ice after he does what he does, but it doesn't happen until the towers actually fall that he starts getting incredibly paranoid. He starts making a lot of very rash decisions, starts assuming drinking or using stimulants if Will's theory is correct, to an extreme degree, and he just like begins to fall apart until eventually he reaches that crescendo with this sort of shouting match in the street. I think that's a really great point that I'll have to consider more for sure, especially when I go back to this book eventually again.
Yeah, that's a great connection. My head is still spinning trying to think about it. So.
It could be complete nonsense, but it's just something that crossed my mind just on some subconscious level. I was like, oh my god, these things are related.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of more of a general pension question, and it is like I am interested in Andrew's view on it, but anyone can answer. But I have been wondering lately, and this is a bit random considering it's a Bleeding Edge wrap up. But this, as I said, it's just kind of more of a general Pynchon thing. I have been wondering, what would Pynchon's legacy be if he had stopped publishing after Gravity's Rainbow? If he never come back with Vineland and all the rest of it. If he had just, I have read stuff about how he was really struggling with writer's block in the late 70s and early 80s, and how he had grown pretty disillusioned with the publishing industry. And it does kind of seem to me like it was possible for a few years there. This is all kind of conjecture, but it does seem possible that he was considering ending his writing career with Gravity's Rainbow. And it is really interesting to me to think about what his legacy would be, how he'd be viewed if Gravity's Rainbow was his final work and he just disappeared after that.
It's an interesting thought. I feel like he would still be widely regarded. Like if he would have finished with Lot 49, I think that's a different story. But the fact that the final thing he would have written would have been what most people, or many people at least, consider to be his best book, if not one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, I do still think he would have had a lot of renown and would be remembered very well in people's eyes. And I think his future works only go on to solidify that, becoming a little more accessible to the public. Things like, a lot of people say Against the Day is a lot more accessible. I disagree, but things like Inherent Vice, I think, become a lot more accessible to the public. So I think he would have been well renowned among literary circles, perhaps, if he stopped publishing after Gravity's Rainbow. But I do think the fact that he continued also, hopefully, makes him more well renowned in the public's eye in general. Not everybody, obviously, but just in a more general sense.
I can't imagine what else he would do outside of writing. I genuinely I struggle with that part of this question. It's a good question, but I can't see him having a day job. He did his time at Boeing, and even that was writing. It was technical writing, but it was still writing. But I can't imagine him, taking up at a Macy's or something like that, working, some bullshit 9-to-5 job. Like the writer's block part of it, I don't doubt at all. I know we've talked about before how he kind of, I think the general consensus is that he had at least the seeds of ideas for Mason and Dixon and Against the Day as far back as the time that Gravity's Rainbow came out. So he clearly had the ideas, and it was just a matter of putting everything together. But I also just don't want to live in a world where his post Gravity's Rainbow work doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
It Against the Day, which that is our next book, as Andrew said, absolutely not accessible, like easily accessible. It is a huge undertaking to read that book, but there's so much in there, and there's so much amazing writing on display, not just in that, but in everything he has done since then. And I can't imagine someone with that wealth of talent within them to just abandon it without doing something else with it. Whether it took him, another 10 years after Vineland came out, like if he didn't publish that in 1990, but he had to hold off until like 2000, I can't imagine him letting go of everything that he wanted to say.
Well, it seems fairly obvious to me that he would open up a detective agency and
I can actually see that.
Yeah.
He would just become Doc Sportillo.
Basically.
Could see him being like a high school film studies teacher or something like that as well.
Oh yeah.
I could see that.
Of course, I would not see him being an English teacher, honestly, even though he's a novelist. But film studies, maybe even math. I just feel like I could see him doing something wacky like that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
well, yeah, you certainly can't hire the guy who misspells a word as simple as says. Not to teach children.
I want to go through and just get everybody's. We'll start with Andrew, if he's amenable to it. Just everybody's favorite part of this book.
Favorite part of this book would have to be. I guess it's gonna be cliche, and a lot of people would probably say the same thing. But the ending of the book has to be my favorite part. There are so many parts throughout the book that are astounding, but I feel like the hope that he left the book with, and I really do think it's one of his most hopeful and one of his most one of his happiest endings, even though it is bittersweet. I do think that it's one of the most beautiful things he's ever written. Every time I look at the last page, I like tear up just because it's such a perfect way to end a novel and such a perfect way to end a career if it is his last book, which I think it's going to be. It's got to be the ending though. The way comes in or the way she just watches her kids go down the elevator, and it's so analogous to the first section of the book, but with a completely different vibe to it. Basically, is just how much things have changed, but we still have to allow our children to go on. We still have to trust that they're going to be the ones who can succeed us and who can bring about actual change within the world. It's his most hopeful call for a counterforce of sorts, even though I don't think she's saying that these kids are going to form the counterforce. I think it's just using it as an analogy for what we can do and what Pynchon hopes we will do, which is the perfect way to end a writing career, and further just makes me realize there's no shot he's going to write another book.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That's I would have said the same thing. And it's specifically for me, it's the last two lines of dialogue. It's all right, Mom, we're good. I know you are, Zig. That's the trouble.
Oh, please, make me tearing up here.
It's so good. It's so good. And
go ahead.
I think you're absolutely right in saying that that's the perfect place to end the book and his career, because there's nothing else to say. It's the kind of full circle of all of this and the culmination of everything, and there's no better choice of words I think that he could have used than what's on the page.
I think it goes to show how much he trusts the younger generation, because so much dialogue surrounds the younger generation about how they are so and they aren't as smart as they used to be in schools, and all of this kind of rhetoric surrounding that idea. And to some extent, that's true. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and I think this is the perfect point, is being a teacher, like seeing the younger generation. And a lot of people say they don't feel a lot of hope when they see them because they're always on their phones and because of all of this. And yes, of course, they are more distracted than they used to be, just like I'm more distracted than I used to be. But I also seen them. They're incredible, and they're so intelligent in different ways than I was when I was a kid, or in different ways than anybody was when they were a kid who's not anymore. And I think it just goes to show that a lot of people might say that he is too old to be writing this type of thing now, but he is one of the few people of his age who can see this weird, distracted, goofy, kind of on the surface a little dumb generation and be like, oh no, they still know exactly what they're doing. They have a shot, probably more than we had a shot, of making the world a better place.
Yeah, the kids are all right.
They are so all right.
I'm impressed with the man's ability to stay optimistic about the coming generations, given that this is the third time he's gone through this sort of cycle.
Yeah.
What about Will, Kate, Luke? What are y'all's favorite parts?
It's really hard. I mean, mine's definitely going to be a conversation between two characters for sure, but just like
which one? Right?
That's the problem. Like, there's a lot of really, really good ones. Like, not just between. I mean, I want to go to the conversation between Ernie and Maxine, like late at night, when he's sort of talking about the internet and kind of illuminating like where all of this stuff comes from and how, you know, you can assume that this was going to be something better, something good, but the roots of those things kind of stretch back farther than you actually can really imagine in most cases. I think it not only invites the reader to have like a healthy skepticism, but it just, there's something that feels very real about that conversation between a father and his daughter in that instance. Like, you know, Ernie's obviously a sort of insert for Pynchon, you know, and you can just imagine him having those same conversations with his kid. And it's a case that offers not just a lot of information to the reader, but like a lot of warmth that we talk about from those familial ties, and it's just sort of like a hard truth to swallow, but certainly one that's important to do so. If you're either Maxine or the reader, that one stands out. I mean, there's a lot of individual thematic work in the book that I really like the way that it runs through the book rather than any sort of like one given moment. Like I love the way that he depicts New York as this city that was changing in 2001. All of that is very accurate. And having read Meet Me in the Bathroom this year, sort of concurrent with this book for a while, to see that transposed so accurately in this kind of like constant background sort of description and construction noise and all of that, I think is really genius stuff. I also really like the scene where Giomara and Maxine go to the ground zero,
Mhm.
and just sort of the way that is depicted and kind of the symbolism of doing that in that chapter. There's a lot. It's not an easy thing for me to narrow it down to one moment or one sort of quote or anything like that in this book.
Yeah, my favorite is definitely the section that covers 9/11. You know, it's well done. It's not. I like that it was. It's not like super dramatic, not super melodramatic. It's very. You know, it kind of shows. It delves into the confusion of that day a little bit, but it's not super drawn out and protracted. You know, there's not all this like. Yeah, I think a different author would have their characters closer to the action, or kind of show more of like have just kind of have more action in general related to 9/11. And if I remember that section correctly, it's very like, Maxine and her kids just kind of sit at home worrying about Horace and watching TV. Even though they're in New York City. Pynchon doesn't try to insert them as like first responders or like people like going down there to help. They're not being heroic. They're just being, just another New York family of New Yorkers, which I really like. And I just find that whole section really interesting to read about. I assume that Pynchon was, if not in New York City during 9/11, he was there either right before or right after, and or had family members there, you would assume. So I just really like that section.
Yeah, I mean, a lesser author, as we continually come back to, would have some stupid, you know, stream of consciousness of watching the TV screen or watching the towers fall. But for my own personal favorite, like Kate said, it's really hard for me to nail down a specific moment or a specific scene that I like heads and shoulders above the rest. But if I have to, I brings me to two options. One is 11 specific words.
Yep.
Is what it is. Is it is what it is. Um, Slightly more seriously, probably I'd have to go to the same scene that Kate mentioned, the conversation between Shiomara and Maxine as they walk towards Ground Zero. I mean, personally, what I love the most about Pynchon's writing is his ability to thread the mystical into the material, and that's really the only part of this book that does that, other than Sean's relentless Lacanian koans. But it's also just a tour de force of writing through that section.
Mhm. That will bring us to closer to the end here. We've got a couple more things that I wanted to go through. We've got some listener comments that we've received over the last week. So we'll go through those real quick. One of them includes a question, and I'm really curious to hear everyone's response to. Starting with Reddit, I'll go through these real quick. We had, and I apologize in advance for any names that I mispronounced, but y'all have some wild names. I love them, but damn, they're hard sometimes. Obat R fan said, "I literally stumbled across this podcast a week. I'm also finishing Bleeding Edge. This is my third Pynchon book after his other easier ones, The Crying of Lot 49 and Inherent Vice. I'm excited to dive in from the start of the season as I digest the novel. Guess I'll have to get started on Against the Day too." We also thank you for that, and yeah, we're excited to get into Against the Day. We'll touch on that a little bit at the end of this episode as well, but looking forward to that. Aeon my dream sequence. My God, I probably horribly butchered that. I'm very excited to hear this. I've been hoping one of the Pynchon podcasts would cover this one. This is in reference to our announcement that we're doing Against the Day next. So can't wait to see where you go with the novel. Thank you again. Really looking forward to it. Going to be a lot of work. And then lastly, Beast World, Against the Day is a monumental undertaking for you. I'm so impressed with what you're doing. I'll be with you all the way. Thank you so much. That really means a lot for us. We also had one from Twitter. This is from James/Mute Branches. Can't wait for the final run through episode of Against the Day in 2072. Definitely feels like it's going to take that long to get through the whole book. But it's I think we're all pretty excited about that one. So, and then here's the one with our question. I'm curious. I know Andrew, you mentioned being a Metal Gear Solid fan earlier, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well as everyone else's. But this is from Cress James Well from Instagram. I'm waiting until I reread Bleeding Edge to listen to the whole series, but one question I have, based on your closer reading of the novel, do you think Pynchon is a Final Fantasy head? I'll start with you, Andrew. Are you familiar with the series at all?
I kind of.
Okay.
I'm horrible in that when I was going to start playing them, I was like, well, you know what I have to do is I have to play them chronologically. So
you don't want to do that.
Yes, I realized that after the first 3, and I have never played it again since, and I realized that's entirely my fault. So I do want to go back and play the ones that are actually supposedly worth playing, because the turn-based combat, and that made me so frustrated that I just gave up.
Yeah, those first 3 are kind of rough. So I am very much a big Final Fantasy fan. Mostly, that series has had some significant clunkers that I've not cared for. But I will say, and especially this is especially kind of relevant going into Against the Day, that Against the Day you could easily map onto the what I would argue are the 2 best of the series, which would be 6 and 7, especially 7. With its wide range of themes and storytelling devices and the cast that is in there and the way that the narrative is woven within itself. There's a lot of parallels that I see in that. And I think the book chemist also talked about that in his review of Against the Day from way back when he did that. But yeah, I mean, the Final Fantasy games themselves, much like Pynchon's work, are a huge investment of time, and you really have to be willing to put that time into them, but they can be very rewarding. For anyone interested in them, I would definitely start with 7. The remake has been phenomenal, and I'm really excited for the third part of that, the finale of that. But I definitely think he's shown and explicitly mentioned Metal Gear Solid and Bleeding Edge, and I get the impression that he might not himself play those games, but I think his kid probably did, and he was there watching a lot of it. I think a lot of that kind of world building and storytelling would be interesting to him from the way he approaches his stories as well. But that's my thought on that. What about the rest of y'all?
I am not familiar enough with Final Fantasy to be able to say, unfortunately.
Neither am I. I mean, off the top of my head, it does seem like the type of thing that Pynchon would know something about. I mean, considering there's Metal Gear Solid references and Bleeding Edge and stuff, he does seem aware of like video games from the 2000s era, 2010s era. It wouldn't surprise me if Pynchon was familiar with Final Fantasy, but I really couldn't say for sure.
Yeah, I can't either. I really haven't played any of them. I think I tried to play Final Fantasy 4 years ago, going off the same kind of instinct that you did, Andrew, trying to start from quote unquote the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do I am contractually obligated to throw Molotov cocktails. So Chrono Trigger's better. Having not played
Chrono
any
Trigger's
of
a fantastic game. No doubt, that's a fantastic game. I do think the inclusion of Metal Gear Solid is definitely interesting. I can absolutely see Pynchon being really into Kojima and his weird ass storytelling, especially having played Death Stranding pretty recently, and my son just started playing it, so I've been kind of watching him and helping him throughout that game. Yeah, I think he's definitely into the sort of weirder side of RPGs and video game storytelling. So, and then our last comment is from YouTube. Nick Dreesen 6702 said, "This is such a great podcast. Can't wait to keep following you throughout my Pynchon journey." Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everyone who left comments for us this last week. We really appreciate all the support that you've given us since we started this, and we look forward to continuing it. But to close this whole thing out, Kate, did you find any interesting bad Goodreads reviews that we can talk about?
We did get not only some bad Goodreads reviews, but we also got an email from our listener Kenneth, who put together an interpretation of Driscoll's Pringle Chip Equation song. He just self-recorded the lyrics with some instrumentation. I actually think it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So we'll close out this episode with Kenneth's recording. Cody, that's just in the email. You can tell.
I heard it this morning. It was really cool.
Yeah, it is actually very cool. Pretty suitably psychedelic and synthy, I think. But yes, I did find some bad Goodreads reviews, just as we did last time. It was harder to find like truly crazy ones than it was with Vineland, because I think a lot of people don't understand Vineland. It seems like a lot of people just didn't like how this book was written, so some of their criticism is a bit less, I'll say, hyperbolic. But these are all from Goodreads, of course. This is a 1-star review. I hated every second that I spent reading this book. First of all, not everything is a question. The dialogues are filled with question marks that really should not be there. Furthermore, the dialogue is often childish, with inclusions such as oops, aw, and creepy. The writing style in general is very annoying. The word like is used about 500 times more often than it should have been used. The transitions are vague and unclear, and to make it all even worse, everything is boring. There's fraud going on, murder, and all sorts of crimes, but nothing is even remotely interesting. In the end, it all leads up to absolutely nothing. Even 9/11 doesn't have any real impact on these people's lives. The novel tries very hard to be funny, with sarcasm and dry comments, but it fails. It completely and utterly fails. All in all, I do not recommend at all.
Don't even know where to start with that one.
No,
I never say oops.
no.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Or creepy.
Not just creepy, but creepy. I'm imagining there were several E's in there. But to say that 9/11 didn't have an impact on the characters, that's
very surprising.
just wrong.
Yeah.
Did they read it?
I don't
Yeah, that's my
think they
question.
did.
Jeez.
Were they expecting them to get covered by the rubble?
Perhaps. Perhaps the fact that Horst did not die in 9/11 made them upset.
Maybe.
Next, we have a 2-star review. This is a real simple one. And late capitalism dissolved? It devolves into messy virtual world complete with Pinchonian paranoia. Truth or conspiracies, ADHD hyperprose, forgettable characters, a pun a minute, convoluted Pomo Chandlerian plot 5 steps ahead of a probably intentionally passive lead heroine. Disappointing. I hate the way that's written, but I especially hate the way that he's calling Maxine a passive lead heroine.
Yeah.
She's one of Pynchon's most self-possessed characters he's ever written. Very sad. This is one that was written very weirdly. I don't really know how to describe the way that it's written, but it's 2-star review. Me and Tome, spelled Tome. I have a reputation on Goodreads for being hyper intelligent.
Oh boy. We're off
We
to a rollicking start.
We got a Franz in here.
Indulging in reading difficult novels. It's a reputation I like to nurture. It's been many years of failure, in fact. Back in college days, spelled DAZE, I was at the checkout desk of the Smucker equals Jam Jelly library, and this friend of mine comes in, fresh out of one of his English equals major classes. This is one of those rare birds on college campuses, an intellectual who actually gave a damn about getting an education beyond mere job equals training. He came up to me all thumbs up saying, Pynchon is where it's at. That was a strong enough argument, and I've been failing to read Pynchon for many years now. Well, I mean, right up to 2009 when I read Inherent Vice. In short order, I'd gathered together V, Lot 49, and Gravity's Rainbow, courtesy of one of those used book equals shops I hung out at. Hipster! Exclamation point, exclamation point. Lot 49 I read twice, and didn't see too much to make a fuss about. I read V with what I recall from today's point equals of equals view as zero understanding except the nose job chapter, and there's a semicolon and no spaces between nose and job, and at least one reading it at dip equals co with a couple rounds of Sam Adams at the bar looking like a real pinch on hipster before I use the word hipster like this in a self-deprecating manner. Well, whatever the hell that was, I mean V, I still have the same Bantam edition. A few short years later, I believe, following on the heels of reading IJ, I started into Gravity's Rainbow and said, ah, yes, I get it. This is fantastic, and I have no idea what's going on. But so I only got through about 2/3 through what is today simply called GR due to some non-literary distractions, still haven't gotten back to it. Meanwhile, Mason and Dixon was published, and I got one of those hot equals off equals the equals presses exemplary. Over the course of several highly distracted months, I read the words on its pages. I recall a few nice things like presidents getting high, big rounds of cheese, a mechanical duck, snow equals balls, chance in hell of me understanding it. But anyway, I even bought a copy for a friend of mine who taught English. Or was it history? Anyways, total failure. Then I bought a copy of Against the Day, also hot off the presses. In fact, it may have been my first Amazon pre-equals order. I ordered it before I ordered it. It sat beautifully on my dresser for approximately 3 years. Meanwhile, somewhere along the line, I placed one of those ubiquitous shelf copies of Vineland and probably Slow Learner on my shelf, pre-equals ordered Inherent Vice in 2009, received it on the post, read it, and Pinchonian equals shaped light bulbs began to light up my meager brain. I get it now. I sailed through Against the Day at speeds equals airships can only fantasize about. I drove quickly into Vineland, thankful that I hadn't read it in 1990 with all the other post-GR disappointed. I was a slow learner, but I read that one too. I mean, by this time, of course, I was well and deep into encyclopedic novel territory, ENT equals space, I having entered via IJ Sot equals weed in the dawn of Quixote. Now here I stood, looking forward to what I've come to think of as Type 2 Pinchon, equals Lot 49 Vineland IV, those Pinchon equals light volumes. What I wanted from Bleeding Edge was some of that light tone. That's what it is. And I am a Pinchon fan equals boy. So whatever, I'll read it. I read it. Here I am. See, I'm a DFW fan equals boy too. But I've moved on, see? I'll read everything that says DFW, but mostly I've moved on to fanning other flames. With Tome 2 I've moved on. But in the case of Tome, I've moved on by moving backwards. 2014, I need to retrace my steps from V through GR to Mason and Dixon to make up for that failure I mentioned up there above. Read Bleeding Edge, don't be disappointed. Take the ride with Maxine. It's still Tome, and something about the world feels different today. 2 stars. I don't I don't know what any of that means.
That whole thing read exactly what I thought someone who patted themselves on the back so hard at the beginning would sound like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all these like other like symbols and stuff in the writing that I'm sure have meaning that I just can't parse out. Sarah gave it 2 stars and said, "Don't expect an astute review comparing this to any other Pynchon novels until the first one I've completed. Perhaps I'm not ready to read them yet, or maybe rather Pynchon was not ready to write a book like this. Although it seems to be part of his shtick, Pynchon's jivey, wisecracking voice grew tiresome to wade through. The narrative was punctuated with moments of true beauty, describing passengers you glimpse in the opposite train as a tarot card draw, and the Geek's Cotillion were 2 of my favorite scenes, but the rest was an onslaught of forced hipness and disembodied voices. Perhaps our humors are on different wavelengths. And I certainly am not savvy when it comes to New York City, but few of the jokes amuse me. The Jewish true-ups grow stale, and Pynchon's random forays into songwriting, well, I'll leave it there. A primary theme in this book in terms of the reader's experience is nostalgia. Chances are, if you're reading Pynchon on the date of this review, you probably lived through September 11th, or 11 September as the book had formatted it, which seemed odd considering the Americanness of the story. References popped up that drew me back to my childhood, like Melody's Mall. What? And even a bizarre mention of my birthplace. But what is disheartening is that Pynchon completely failed to capture the spirit of what it was like to truly be immersed in the internet at that time period. Sure, I was a startup myself back in 2001, but already a lot of my life and friends, mystery, and dare I say magic exploded from wires hooked up to my computer. Of course, this story takes place on a grander scale than a teen's bedroom, but Maxine's travels in Deep Archer, a kind of, from what I gathered, Second Life virtual reality, was almost laughable. It was a bizarre deviation into cyberpunk territory. Would I next be reading Maxine downloading a Russian form of kung fu to hear downloading a Russian form of kung fu to her head to combat the Russian mafia twins. Pynchon invents something called the deep web, where people can get lost looking at it themselves, it seems. A place where you glimpse celebrities and witness beautiful graphics, but frankly, in those nascent days, the tech was just not that available to consumers to power such a program that it would work. I willingly suspended disbelief, but after a few bouts, it just seemed like Pynchon was not truly writing about the tech of 2001. Another nitpicky thing that this would have been amusing in mid-80s cyberpunk novel was the continual hash slinging of web and programming terms that seemed out of place or used inappropriately. Another reviewer noted that there's also occasionally heavy-handed foreshadowing. Ooh, this guy's talking about YouTube. Clever. I'm totally willing to admit that I had a difficult time A, following the narrative, B, staying invested in the heroine, more on that later, and C, understanding the plot. So I could be wrong about the plot and point in my next bit, but the real shocker was the bizarre truther undercurrent to the story. Mr. Pynchon, is that your tinfoil hat showing? If you want to use that as the crux of your book, fine, but such a debatable and far-fetched conspiracy theory is going to detract from the rest of your book, which, despite my qualms, does a decent job depicting the era. I'm totally willing to admit that I have a difficult time A, following the narrative, and B, staying invested in the heroine, but I can't forgive this. The characters seemed stereotypical and cartoonish. Maxine and Windust affair was so bizarre. And we get it, she's Jewish! Even the big scary microchipping villain is a letdown. In the end, the affair is taken care of with a screaming match in the streets that seems more appropriate for some alley in a ghetto or MTV reality TV. There's no real resolution, no big sigh at the end, no pay for slogging through the flights of fancy prose. Quite frankly, the only character I could identify with and wanted to read more about was Maxine's Ben and Jerry scarfing, biopic watching Midwestern silo husband Horst. Perhaps that says something with the types of books I should be reading instead.
Really came apart at the end there.
Yeah. Wanting to be more invested in Horst is a red flag.
Yeah, a little bit.
Compared to the previous prior reviews you read out, I got many fewer gripes with that one.
Yeah.
But I just has she read 80s sci-fi?
I don't get the impression that she has.
Early cyberpunk is chock full of specific references to specific computer science and programming terminology. Yeah, that's what?
Yeah, it seems as though her reservations were that everything was not accurate to the time period. I have two more. One is a 2-star review from Gerhardt. It took me ages to finish this. It starts off strongly, then seems to get mired down in the minutiae of a Byzantine plot that just made my eyes glaze over every time I began reading again. I had various reservations about this. First, Maxine is a troublesome heroine. A mother of 2 teenage boys just doesn't go around backing a couple of firearms and doing weird things like engaging in foot sex. A lot has been made of the fact that this is Pynchon's big 9/11 novel, but the actual events of that fateful day in 2001 are rather tangential to the book and its plot. Of much more interest are the repercussions and refractions of that event. This is by and large a weird kind of swan song for the internet, which Pynchon seems to believe is the ultimate iteration of consumer capitalism, likely to swallow up the entire world in a blaze of pixels like a collapsing black hole. His discussions of the deep web sound like William Gibson on drugs. Pynchon's attitude to the internet is wildly contradictory. There's a lot of nostalgic whimsy about it being the last true electronic frontier, and then there's the notion of it being diabolical, born from the fevered brains of defense people caught in the clutches of the Cold War. This guy needs to read Mason and Dixon. New York in this novel is a strange combination of Woody Allen charm and Raymond Chandler noir. Well, the whole darn book is strange. It delights in tripping up the reader at every opportunity. As well versed in narrative duplicity as we think we may be, Pynchon is the master of genre tropes and how to subvert them. The period detail in this is quite astonishing. While the writing is some of Pynchon's most relaxed and funny ever, some of the jokes are groan-inducingly bad. I would go so far as to say this is the perfect introduction for a new reader. There was just something about the book that left me cold. I didn't feel an emotional connection with the characters, and a lot of it seemed like set dressing for what ultimately end, who knows. There's no real ending either, it just kind of peters out.
Single mother of 2 just would not.
No, just simply would not.
No.
All right, this is the last one, which is a 1-star review. Go back to it. Let's get it right out of the way. Right off the top, virtually anything is going to be better than discussing this book. Anything else qualifies. Right now, the radio is on, for example. That qualifies. In fact, it compares. It's national public radio. Strangely appealing as it may be, the national non-commercial radio network in the United States, NPR, is also kind of bland. And if the truth isn't too harsh, also a little bit Canadian. Lush choirs of the mildly amusing sing daily from a hymn book that was created by the ghost of pre-net mainstream media, saying fervently within its time-honored motto, quote, first, do nothing to draw undue attention, unquote. Soloists step up to the microphone and drop convenient narrative rings around the news to dot the I's of their accounts little hearts and happy face. They're the close-mic'd heavy breathers, the regular guy types, the news kids who get it, the old guard who specialize in the script-cued, deeply reflective Santa-style chuckles. Those are the standard bearers, without whom the broadly vanilla-sounding network would have no natural timbre, no feeling for its own brand. Contrarily, there are divas and the coloraturans, the ones who make it all worthwhile. The demure, if droll, Eleanor Beardsley Paris, whose taut delivery and reserve immediately call to mind snappy dress and neat shoes. The hearty, total grown-up, tonal complexity of Sylvia Pigoli, Rome, with whom we may picture ourselves having a quick Ricard and espresso. Or the smoky-voiced insights of this listener's favorite, the exotic mezzo Afiba Quist Arctan Dakar, whom simply must be heard to be believed and savored. All master journalists, all practitioners of the arcane and articulate science of the foreign correspondent. But they are few and far between. There must be understudies and stand-ins in any production, and NPR has a continent's worth of communication pagers rushing the doors and elevators to take their part. But this brings us to the dimmer side, the bleeding, wasted edge of NPR news, entertainment, infomedia. For reasons that aren't exactly transparent, NPR also showcases brain-numbingly stupid segments, meant more to me as entertainment. The minimally newsy, wait, don't tell me, was, as far as I could tell, created as a kind of forerunner to reality television that withholds, as radio must, any diversionary visual layer as it grinds on and on. And even the creators and perpetrators of Car Talk have long ago left the building for the Witness Protection Program. This is the reason that the car troubles keep centering cars like the 1987 Taurus. Taupe is eternal, but enough. Winding back around to Thomas Pynchon's insufferable, arch-corny mega-spam of a 9/11 novel, stuffed with a cliché and recycled shtick, I can think of only a single comparison. Right now, anyway. Well, that's the window I'm willing to dedicate to the search. Pynchon's new novel is the Prairie Home Companion of novels, larded with an authorial presence that is smirkly sophomoric, situations that are old hat at their best, and by turns, dopely sci-fi on slippery slope Comic-Con tip. Leading Edge reminds the casual reader of National Public Radio gone unavoidably. Jesus, my screen just did something strange. Bleeding Edge reminds the casual reader of National Public Radio gone unavoidably stale. In a novel that wants to be New York and edgy, Pynchon has given us Lake Wobegon on the Hudson, an appalling waste of talent and my time. Quote, what might only be a simple point on the workday cycle becomes a million pedestrian dramas, each one charged with mystery, more intense than a high barometer daylight can ever allow. Everything changes. There's that clean, rained-on smell. Traffic noise gets liquefied. Reactions from the street into the windows of city buses fill the bus interiors with unreadable 3D images that surface unaccountably transforms to volume. Unquote. So no real detail on why he doesn't like the book.
I'm still trying to process Lake Wobegon or Wobegon, like
on the Hudson.
Yeah, on the Hudson. I can't even think straight now. What a bizarre comparison.
Why does he hate Canada so much?
I don't know. I don't know why he felt the need to denigrate Canada for a second in this screed on NPR.
What about the book has anything to do with NPR? I
know.
No idea.
Smug tone but still, what?
Yeah, I genuinely don't know. And that was kind of it was hard to find like good ones because a lot of it was like, well, I didn't really understand it, or like, well, it just kind of ends, or like, well, it just sort of like it wasn't that interesting, or just clear like misinterpretations of what was going on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And
nothing
then it was
terribly unhinged.
Yeah, and then it was the other stuff like that last one where he talks about NPR for a really long time, or the one that has like all of the weird like experimental symbol editing and all of that. Overall, very interesting demographic of people over there reviewing Bleeding Edge.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of yet another of Thomas Pynchon's books. This has been a wild ride, and I've loved it. And I've come away with a much deeper appreciation for a book that I did enjoy when I started, or the first time I read it, but definitely enjoy more so now. So just to touch on it before we wrap up here, we are going to be taking a well-earned break before we get into Against the Day. We'll be back in November to start that one. And if you missed the announcement in our episode last week, we're going to be shifting to a bi-weekly format. Instead of going once a week, we'll be every other week, just to help us undertake such a huge novel and make sure that we can make the show as good as possible. On that note, if you like what we're doing and you want to support the show, please consider making a donation on Ko-Fi. Funds that we get on there will be used to upgrade our equipment, pay hosting fees, and help make the show better in general. So that's on ko-fi.com/mappingthezone. We will do some bonus episodes in between now and Against the Day. So keep an eye out for those. No idea what we're going to do them on yet, but we'll figure that out and get them out when we have a chance. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on and talking with this book about us and drawing the parallels between this and Gravity's Rainbow has been really insightful. Again, the Gravity's Rainbow analysis Substack link will be in the notes. So please go and check that out. And Andrew, again, thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you guys for having me. I had a lot of fun. It's actually the first podcast I've ever been on, so I really enjoyed doing it. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing it. And I've loved listening to all of your analysis of Bleeding Edge throughout my listen of it. It was very insightful, very helpful, and I'd always love to come back if you guys do it. Well, when you guys do another one of Pynchon's works, it was a lot of fun.
Awesome, thank you, and we'll for sure have you back if you want to come back when we do Gravity's Rainbow.
Oh yeah, please.
I can't think of many better people to come on for that. So,
thank you.
Thank you again, everyone, for listening and sticking with us. And we'll be back in November to start Against the Day. Keep an eye out for the bonus episodes as they come. And we're going to leave you with Kenneth's version of the Pringle Chip Equation song to play us out and conclude this book. So thanks again, and see you later.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Every day was a party, and we were the new kids in town. The guitar and joyride, nobody in red-eyed, too high to ever come down. Salary double cut, welcome sign up to find my status quo in the house. Little techies just chilling there, more than the millionaires off the way love them bounce. Have drifted away. The streets are still longing, we're hustling and longing, just like they were back in the day. I'm find me. Maybe you'll find me. Thank you, Marcus Gray. We've been privileged to equation. You've been beautiful.